Welcome to Keiser Voices, the story of success, brought to you by Keiser University Graduate School, here where the academic world meets personal triumph. Join us today as we dive into the captivating tales of success.
Welcome back, everybody, to another amazing episode of Keiser Voices. And we're excited to have with us one of our criminal justice and homeland security professors from the graduate school, Dr. Gregory Vecchi. One thing I want to note about Dr. Vecchi before we start our conversation is his amazing background in this field. He's worked for the FBI as a unit chief, and crisis negotiator, where he retired from. He's an author, consultant, and as well as training. He does Department of Homeland Security threat evaluation as a master trainer, threat assessment, threat intervention, and tactical negotiation. So when we talk today about behavior threat assessment, I can't think of anyone better to have this conversation with. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Vecchi.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
So as we talk about behavior threat assessment, I think we're going to kind of focus a little bit more on that active shooter, because unfortunately, that's something we're seeing all too often in media. And just, I mean, it's a terrifying thought to have to, wonder about sending your kids to school or kids to college or going to a concert, that this could be an unfortunate reality. But how does behavior threat assessment help us in preventing active shooter incidents? But even more so, what is behavior threat assessment?
Well, behavioral threat assessment is a process where essentially, if you see a concerning behavior, it's how to deal with that concerning behavior and coming up with some sort of a threat confidence level, so to speak, and some sort of a threat level, then having appropriate interventions. And I think, even before we can understand what threat assessment is, I think we have to kind of go back a bit and understand what type of offenders, what type of violence this really is, because this is a really unique form of violence, especially when you're talking about school violence and specifically active shooters.
So what would we look for? What would be those warning signs or even behaviors that we would expect of someone who would be more inclined to act in this way?
Well, I think first we should probably understand that these type of offenders are experiencing some sort of a grievance. That's essentially it. When we think of active shooters or active killers or things like this, a lot of times we think of that, the crazed psychopath, right? That person who comes in, he's a stranger, he's coming in to, cause, death and mayhem and destruction and everything. And that's almost never the case in schools. There are a number of things we have to look at when we're looking at these type of offenders. First of all, they are predators, okay? And what predators do is they plan and they prepare and they engage in premeditated violence. It's not something that just happens. No one just wakes up and decides to go shoot up their school or their university, or even their workplace, right? So you have to understand that we're not talking about a process predator. Process predator is someone, when you think of a serial killer, right? Or you think of like the psychopath or the psycho or the crazy person, that's a process predator. And the motivation for those guys is the fact that they enjoy the process of violence. They enjoy it. They enjoy the power and control. That's not our guy or our girl, right? Because females also commit these crimes, although it is male dominated. The other type of predator that it's not is a resource predator. Resource predator is like a bank robber or someone that breaks into your house in the evenings or in the night, tries to steal stuff. Maybe the person who kills someone for insurance money, right? For life insurance. What we're dealing with here specifically in nearly all of these cases, in fact, I can't think of any workplace violence, university violence, or K through 12 violence anywhere that wasn't the result of some sort of grievance that grew over time. And what I mean when I say grievance is there are four types we look at when we're doing these assessments. First off, we're looking for the loss. Someone who loses something that's important to them in their life, like let's say a job, maybe poor grades, maybe they don't get tenure. All of these have been reasons why someone has eventually decided to commit violence against other people. The other one is just feeling wrong. Sometimes we call these the grievance collectors. They collect these wrongs from other people, and it gets to the point that they determine that violence is the answer based on that. And then we've got um, persecutorial type of a grievance, and that's your bullying, and that happens a lot. It happens in schools, it happens in universities, it also happens in the workplace, although we don't think about that sometimes. And the last one, or the last type of grievance is ideology. And this is going to be maybe a religious ideology, political, a number of things, right? And so, however you look at it, rather it's being bullied, attack on body image, conflict with teachers or professors, conflicts with peers, feelings of isolation, things like that. All that basically comes down to grievance. And if you look at every single school shooting, every single university shooting, and every single workplace, you're going to find that grievance is the first thing we're looking at. So when we're looking at behavioral threat assessment, that's the first step in the process that all of these shooters go through on the way to the actual violence. And it's because of this process that they all go through that is actually what gives us an opportunity to intervene and prevent it.
So we're talking like, they could be posting already on social media that like, oh, you wronged me, just you wait. I think they're
Sure.
I grew up with Columbine. That was
Hmm.
when I was in school. And I remember them saying that there had been signs from those students that participated in that.
Yeah, and that's 100%. In fact, that's really one of the things that you're looking at is, what's different about this student or this person. How is he or she different today than they usually are? Because here's what we have to understand. And I guess we can, you mentioned this earlier, what do they go through and how do we what steps do they go through? Well, there's essentially 10 steps, all the way from the grievance all the way to the actual attack, whatever that is. Typically it's a firearm, but it doesn't really, the weapon actually doesn't matter, because what we have found is that if the person can't get a gun, which is usually the best option if you're going to hurt or kill people, obviously, they'll find something else, because not being able to get a gun doesn't change the way that they feel. And so they'll find other ways. And so, like, for example, in K through 12, um, probably I think roughly 60% is firearms and 40% is edged weapons. And when we interviewed these kids on the averted cases or in the completed cases where they survived, they would tell us that, hey, I just couldn't get the gun. I preferred a gun, but I can't get the
Mhm.
gun because I didn't have access to it. So they went and changed their plan to a knife. And so when we think about, regardless of what's actually used to carry out the attack, the first and foremost thing is that we have to understand this idea of this grievance. And it's a very specialized type of grievance. It isn't like your everyday, oh, you are irritating me type stuff, right? Because, we all go through every single week, and we can probably name off 5 or 6 people that irritated us or done something that has frustrated us, and almost always that never results in violence. And so it's not the normative type grievances we're talking about. It's the type of grievance where the person who's experienced it gets to the point where they can't cope with it anymore. And I'll use bullying as an example, because that's the easiest one for everyone to understand.
Mhm.
If someone comes to school and they are bullied by someone, okay? They don't like it, obviously. So there's your grievance. But that alone right now isn't going to lead to them planning to come back and kill that person. it's over time. And so that bullying, they come back the next day and they're still being bullied. Maybe they tell the bully to stop bullying and they don't stop. Maybe they report it to their teacher, or they report it to their professor, or they report it to their parents. They complain to their peers. And the bullying keeps going on. And this goes on day after day, week after week. At some point, they get to the point that they go into crisis. In other words, the frustration of this grievance becomes so bad that from their perspective, they can't take it anymore. And when you can't take it anymore and you have nowhere to turn, because typically they've tried to get help from other people, then they go into crisis. And that's the difference. So it's this out of control frustration regarding whatever the grievance is that happens over time that leads to them getting on this what's just termed this pathway to violence, right? So that
Mhm.
first step is that grievance and crisis. At that point, then 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 violence becomes the answer. And so that violent ideation and that intent where they actually target someone, right? They choose their teacher, their professor, maybe another student, maybe it's a group, maybe it's the football team because they feel wronged because they're not athletic and maybe they get bullied or something like that, right? Or maybe it's the school or university itself, right? Anyone is the enemy because that whole school has wronged me, and so now everyone is in danger. And then once they decide that violence is the answer, they do what everybody else is going to do. If you're going to plan to do something, you research it, you get on the internet, you look at previous attacks, you try to plan on what day, what hour, where is the attack going to happen, what's the schedule look like, where are the maps? Maybe get a map of the university, maybe people that are going to be safe. So safe lists versus hit lists, the ones that are on the target. What type of weapons, what type of guns, what type of equipment, things like this. And then once they kind of figure that out, they start moving into the planning and preparing. Or I'm sorry, the preparing and optimizing, doing dry runs, paying attention where the fire alarms are, where the cameras are. A lot of times they want to set up their own camera or some way to record it. And then if nothing happens to intervene, then the violence happens. And here's what's really sad is that, we'll hear of a school shooting,
Mhm.
such and such school, and so many dead. Oftentimes, the perpetrator ends up dying to either by their own hand or by the police, however it turns out. And everybody turns and says, you know what? You know, eh, we never thought this could happen here. We never knew about this. And here's the deal. The bottom line is that there is tons of evidence and indicators out there, and you actually brought it up. The term is called leakage. When
Mhm.
someone is in crisis, I'm going to go back to the beginning. Let's say someone gets bullied or gets treated unfairly, and they get to the point they're in crisis. Um, they are going to act differently. Maybe they're going to be more agitated. Maybe they're going to slip up and maybe say things that seem threatening against someone. They're going to start looking at things like maybe gun magazines that they've never done before. Maybe they go and ask their friend to take them out to the shooting range, and that's the first time they've ever done that. Changes in these behaviors, and it's these changes that we operationalize, and that's where the threat assessment piece comes with the training
Mhm.
and what I'm talking about is to identify these behaviors along this pathway, and deal with that person, usually just through crisis intervention, just sitting down with that person saying, hey, it seems like you're having a bad day. What's going on? And let that person become that person's helper, right? Rather you're a peer or you're a mental health professional or even the security person or SRO, wherever you might be, that person needs help. And the sooner you do this, when people change their behaviors, the much higher chance we have of preventing these through behavioral threat assessment.
So how can schools, universities, or even workplaces, how do they typically implement this threat assessment process?
Well, first you have to have training. And so there's essentially two types of training. So when I train threat assessment teams in universities and schools, I'll go in and the first thing is you've got to train everybody on what targeted violence is. What are we looking for? And train people on, hey, look, it's the little things. People, you hear this term, the see something, say something, right? And
Mm,
everybody knows that term, but it really doesn't mean anything until you really think about what are we talking about. The way threat assessment works is what we do is we establish a baseline on a student body, a baseline on individual students. And what I mean by a baseline is their normal behavior. And so if you think about it, everyone who goes, let's say, like to Kaiser, right? Everybody goes to Kaiser, whether it's, online or in person, they have a relationship with the various people around them, with their professors, with their peers, their parents, their grandparents, maybe a coach if they're in sports, mental health counselors, you name it. And so every single one of those people that know that student, for example, understand that student from their perspective. And so in that relationship, you have what you would consider normal behavior for that student, right? And
mm,
the behavior is going to be different because obviously a student is going to act differently in front of their professor than they are their best friend or a stranger or their coach or their grandmother, right? So each one of those people that know that student understand what is normal behavior for that relationship. And so when a student or someone goes into a crisis, their behaviors change radically. And I'm talking about, a crisis where they can't cope with a grievance. And that radical change is noticed by everybody, but it's a little bit different for everybody. So maybe for some who know the person really well, they're an anti-gun, and all of a sudden they are interested in guns. Completely different, right? The professor notices that, hey, this student is always active, is talkative, and they're very withdrawn, or they're not coming to class at all. And so all of these changes in their behavior, if you add it up, it makes sense to someone who is trained in threat assessment. So your first training is to everybody. It's to the faculty, it's to the administrators, it's to everyone who's going to be in contact with, students and people that work at the university. And the training has got to be just kind of what I explained here, trying to understand the relationships, understanding abnormal behavior, normal behavior, and then feeling comfortable to just report that behavior, even though it doesn't seem like it be important. All right. And so that's the first training. The second training is actually for the people who would actually do the threat assessment. So let's say I was a threat assessor. Okay. And I was working
mhm,
at Kaiser, and there was a student of concern, and we call that a concerning student. This student is, exhibiting behaviors that are really off base to his coach, his parents, his professors, his peers, and whoever else. And let's say each one of those people in that student's life saw one thing that was really odd, compared to what is normal. And they would report that one thing to me. As a threat assessor, I can take all those things reported by various people and then put it on a time series and then look at and find out, well, is this person either on the pathway? If they are on the pathway, are they in grievance, violent ideation, research and planning, or preparation? Because the next step is the attack. And so you can tell them by looking at the behaviors, okay, where they are on that pathway and how then which appropriate interventions. If they're to the point where they're buying guns and going to the range, then we're probably going to get law enforcement involved. But if they're down on the, hey, they're bullied, they can't really take it anymore, they're really upset, they're crying, we can deal with it at that level just through crisis intervention. So it dictates appropriate interventions, and it's based on the concerning behavior. So we're not profiling anybody. There's no profiling involved in this. It's strictly on reported, observed behaviors or other stuff like what you had mentioned earlier, where they give indications that they are planning something. And we call that leakage. And so students, the younger the person is, the more leakage we typically have. And what leakage means is maybe it's on social media, right? They're posting, pictures of Columbine all of a sudden. Really weird. That's really weird for this person, right? That is maybe evidence of leakage. That needs to be reported. And so as the threat assessment team, you bring in all of this stuff that's on social media, stuff that is overheard, things that are observed. And the key to this is that the people who are reporting it should understand that they're not rats. You're not being a snitch. What you're doing is you're helping someone who's in crisis. And the second thing is don't judge your observations or your detections of these abnormal behaviors. It's not your job, because you might look at something and say, he's probably just having a bad day, right? And if everybody in that student's life said that, then none of that would get to me as a threat assessor. Because even if you're wrong, who cares? Nothing's going to happen to the student. Nothing's going to happen to anyone. It's just going to be reported, and it's going to be, is it a threat? Is it not a threat? Do we just watch and wait? Do we monitor? Or do we do something where we can actually intervene to help that student? Because the so-called killers are not monsters. These are not, some crazy psychopaths coming into university. They're people. They're people that typically we know, people that are supposed to be there, people that we love, friends, family. Now, do they do terrible things? Yes, absolutely. And obviously, if they do commit violence or crimes, of course, you got to deal with that as you would anybody else. But the nice thing about the threat assessment concept is that it's a way to help that person. We look at it, the threats as basically expressions of frustration, right? That if they go ignored or unattended, then what happens is that's what goes closer to being violent. That's when it's going up that pathway. But if we understand that this targeted violence there's no snap effect, it's very rational, it's very easy to understand from the perspective of that person. If we start from that, then a lot of this stuff, and I mean a huge amount of this stuff, can be prevented. Because if you look back at nearly every shooting, you'll see these very same indicators that I'm talking about pop up over months and years sometimes. And we've seen this across the board in workplace, university, and K through 12 attacks.
I watched a documentary last night, and the sibling, she says, looking back, I can pinpoint the exact day that I should have asked my brother what was wrong. So I've definitely heard that before. And I have three thoughts, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to ask you first. But I think I want to go with, you mentioned profiling. And I feel like profiling is something that we think we know because of shows like Criminal Minds. But what's the difference between profiling and behavior threat assessment?
Well, see, so profiling, well, first of all, profiling is in the past. The crime has already happened. So you're trying to study a crime scene, and you're trying to infer the observations to try to come up with, a person of interest, right? And profiling oftentimes uses demographics, meaning race, culture, things like that, right? And in the bad case of profiling, we talk about profiling, and we talk about racial profiling, stuff like that, which is absolutely terrible. But it's not profiling, because we already have the concerning behavior, and we already have the person that concerning behavior is attached to. So it doesn't matter if the person's white or black or female or male or speaks English or Spanish or whatever. It's the behavior that we focus on, not the demographics or the profile of that person.
And one other thing that you had said, you mentioned social media and leakage. So I'm going to assume that social media is both plays a good and bad role in this. It's good
Mhm.
because the leakage, like I don't think with Columbine, I'm trying to think back. It's not like they could have seen anywhere in social media that these boys had been planning this. But when you look at more recently, um, whether the Parkland shooting or even the one that just recently happened in New Orleans, there had
Mhm.
been social media posts. But
Mhm.
does social
Yeah.
media also hinder as much as it helps?
Well, again, you got to look at it from the standpoint of is the it's a different type of concerning behavior, right? So it really depends on what they're posting, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you know the person, and here's the deal, you have people that like to just shock people, right? They just like to get under people's skin, and that's just their normal behavior. Okay, so they go on social media and they'll post something outrageous, right? If that's not abnormal, if that's normal for the person, then really it's not really a good indicator of threat. But if it's something that is different, unique, something that is kind of an anomaly, or something that ties into other information you already have, right? And that's where the social media can be helpful because it might point you to a person where, like for example, they say something and five people like it or whatever, or you can find out through social media who's paid attention to that post as a potential lead to go interview. Now, it doesn't mean they're involved, right? But you go say, okay, well, this person, this person, this person, this person engaged, commented on it, liked it. I would use that as an investigator, right? Because threat assessment is an investigative process, really. Go in and interview those people. What do you know about this? Because they may have information that's super valuable that they don't even know they have. And so, kind of, what I didn't finish explaining was, how do you set up the threat assessment teams, right? So you got your
Mm-hmm.
training, right? We just talked about that. So everyone's trained on what to look for and report. Then the threat assessors are taught how to make sense of those reported behaviors. The teams are typically they're diversified teams. We call them multidisciplinary. They, at a very minimum, should be composed of someone from administration, someone from mental health, a counselor, anybody, psychologist, whatever, and then someone who represents law enforcement or security. And those are your three minimum, or your three, I guess, constant members you should have on your team. Then, as things happen, so let's say that uh, there was a threat and involved a teacher or someone that might be relevant, or a professor or someone else. You bring them onto the team as needed based on what the situation is. And then it's a very basically it's procedure, right? You collect the stuff, you timeline it, you talk to people, you develop other leads, and you run it down. And so one of the things here is that we're not violating anyone's rights, okay? Because it's no different than if you were going to do some sort of disciplinary action. Someone had done something, you're going to do the investigation and then come up with some sort of a conclusion. Either it's nothing, excuse me, or maybe we've got something that we need to deal with. The threat assessment's the same thing, although it's not discipline. All we're doing is trying to figure out, is a concerning behavior um, any a threat in any way, shape, or form, is essentially what we're doing. And I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, it turns out to be nothing, right? These don't happen that often. It takes almost like the perfect storm to have someone that gets to the point that they actually breach, into a classroom and kill people, right? Doesn't happen that often. I mean, it's terrible, but it really doesn't happen that often. I think in 2023 there were a total of 48 in the United States. That's it. Because if you count the other things like domestic violence
Mm-hmm.
shootings, if you count gang violence, accidental or negligent discharges of firearms, suicides, um, all that. If you eliminate all of that and you stick it, or you confine it to the actual type of crime or activity we're talking about, it's very unique, and so therefore it's not as it's not as frequent as we often think.
That makes sense. And I know you've kind of touched on this a couple of times, but I really think it's important to emphasize this. How can students, faculty, and staff contribute to a safer environment, without creating fear, without creating stigma, without feeling they're putting a target on
Mhm.
somebody's back? I mean,
Mhm.
how can any one of us do that?
Well, it's kind of, I mean, the short answer is there really needs to be a culture change in universities, workplaces, and schools. And what I mean by a culture change is kind of a re-understanding of what we're dealing with. That we are not typically we're dealing with people. We are dealing with human beings. We're dealing with people who end up doing terrible things based out of what starts out as a grievance that kind of gets out of control. And so, if we understand that we're dealing with human beings and that it's based on a grievance that gets to the point where violence becomes the only answer, then that gives us a little bit better perspective to say, hey, look, what can I do to help? Well, we can't read minds, obviously, right? But what we can do is we know when someone, like I said, if you have a friend of yours or your parent or someone you know well or that you see fairly often, you know when they're acting weird, right? You know when they're doing something that's concerning. And so what we have to be able to get through to people is that we're not ratting on people because when these things are reported, no one gets in trouble, including the person that's engaged in concerning behavior. It's a trigger for us to help that person. And so we have to kind of change the culture and the thought process that if you see something concerning, don't judge it, report it to your whoever you're supposed to report it to, right? And we got to have people designated for this also. It's not a haphazard thing because if it's haphazard, that gets problematic, it becomes ineffective, and then it gets that bad vibe about it, right? Like you had mentioned. This is about helping others. This is about stopping violence. It's about reporting things and not being judged for reporting those things. Because if I have 5 people report something to me and I do my analysis and my assessment and I find out that there's nothing there, no one gets in trouble, right? But if you don't report that stuff and then the person then becomes violent and then we go back, when now we're where we always seem to be, right? That oh my God. Well, this happened, this happened, and you have all of those, you know, dots we didn't connect, right? And so connecting the dots means first and foremost is finding the right dots and then connecting them and then doing an assessment so the appropriate intervention can be done. That's in everyone's best interest because this is a legal and an ethical approach to violence prevention. And it does not violate FERPA, it does not violate HIPAA, and it does not violate personally identified information.
See something, say something, and
Right,
help.
but right, see something, say something, but make sure you know what you're seeing, you know what you're saying, and the person who's listening to that see something, say something knows what to do with it. That's what we're missing.
It makes a lot of sense. This has been so insightful and eye-opening. We can't thank you enough, Dr. Vecchi, for joining us here on Keiser Voices and having this conversation with us. Thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure.
And if you guys have enjoyed this conversation, be sure to tune in the whole month of June as we take a look at criminal justice from different angles and different perspectives that maybe we need to have, like today's conversation. And so be sure to like, share, subscribe, and follow as we continue this conversation. We'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you for journeying with us today on Keiser Voices, the story of success. As we close this chapter, remember every story has its next page.